So, yes, I'm Jack Hersch, and I'm the author of the book Death March Escape. So what I want to talk about tonight, I'll talk about the book, I'll talk about my father, I'll talk about me. I'm an integral part of the book as well, and the process I went through in researching about my father's story and about my own story, and then I'll take questions at the end. So this is a photo of my father. Now, to start at the beginning of the beginning, the reason I put this picture up here, and I have a few other pictures of my dad, is because when you hear the word survivor, I think you get an image in your mind. If you know people who are survivors, more likely than not, they fit that image that you've heard, or the image that you see in Schindler's List, or the image you see when you hear about Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi, these guys. For the most part, my experience with those portrayals is they're downbeat, they're morose, they're quiet, they haven't cracked a joke since the day they got into a cattle car on their way to Auschwitz. They haven't cracked a smile since that day. My father and my father's friends, I grew up with a lot of Holocaust survivors. My father and his friends were nothing like that. They were interesting and funny and loved life and cracked jokes and cracked smiles as much as they could. So, but now this photo of my father, he was about 17 or 18 years old. We don't know exactly how old he was. And the reason we don't know is because I never had this photo. I have a few photos of my dad from before the war. I don't have this one. This one is actually an integral part of the story. Yes, it's a headshot. Turns out he was a male model. He was a good-looking guy, or as I would often say, out of earshot, he was a good-looking guy. Just ask him. That's my dad. This photo was taken, it's dated 1945. Now, my father was rescued in early May 1945. This photo was taken in the hospital, really a sanatorium that he was in. It was in Passau, Germany, about 50 miles away from the concentration camp where he was and where he escaped from. I don't have an exact date, but my guess is, given how skinny he is in this photograph, it was probably the summer of 45. So he's been out of concentration camp 3 or 4 months at the most. See the smile on his face. I mean, this guy just loved to be here. This photo was taken in 1960. That's my dad, he's 35, and he's with my mother, who's 30. They'd been married for 5 years at the time. It was in a New Year's celebration. Now, my father, at the time he was living in Long Beach, Long Island, he was working either as a busboy or as a waiter. I don't know which one, but he liked to dress well. He liked to be good looking, and so I have this photo, and I thought I would share it with you. This is the last photo I'm going to show you of my dad. He's 75 years old. Those are my identical twin girls who were 10 at the time with him. It was in the last year of his life, but again, you know, I would like to guess that the 4 photos you just saw are not the kind of photos you expect to see when you hear of a survivor. Anyway, a quick look at his life. First, what I talked about in the book, and then what happened after the book, because the book essentially ends when the war ends. And by the way, I put his middle name up there, Arieh. It's a Hebrew word that means lion, which was actually kind of an interesting name for a guy who kind of, I think, portrayed that, personified that in many ways. He was born July 13th, 1925, in Dej, Romania. Dej was, well, Dej is in Transylvania. Transylvania is like the Catskills or the Appalachian Mountains. It's rolling hills. It's beautiful, beautiful country. It belonged to Austria until the end of World War I. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At the end of World War I, it was taken from Austria and given to Romania. It was Romanian until the beginning of World War II. Hungary was allied with Germany, and so now, as a reward for that, Germany gave Transylvania to Hungary. So for 5 years now, Transylvania was Hungarian. After the war, Romania got it back. My father was a son of a cavalry soldier, not a cavalry officer, a cavalry soldier in the Austro-Hungarian army. He fought in World War I. He was captured by the Russians, spent 4 years as a Russian prisoner. When my father got back from Russia, he started a small soap factory. My grandfather, I'm sorry, got back from Russia. He started a small soap factory, and that's how he earned his living. My father was the youngest of 8, 4 boys, 4 girls. 25 people in their immediate family. It's because the 5 oldest were already married and had kids by the time they were sent off to concentration camp. And 25 is an important number, as you'll see in a few minutes. My father was deported to Auschwitz first on June 6, 1944. Now, what else happened on June 6, 1944? D-Day, right. So while we're landing on Omaha Beach and Utah Beach, my dad and his family are being put in cattle cars and going to Auschwitz. He escaped on April 16th, 1945. We know that date for his second escape. We don't know the date of his first escape. We only know that it was early April. It was about 10 days earlier. He was rescued by the U.S. Army on May 6th. The book essentially ends there. My father then spent 18 months in a hospital. He had typhus, tuberculosis, peritonitis, and pneumonia, and probably a lot of other things that he didn't even realize he had. Oh, and by the way, he weighed something in the order of 77 or 78 pounds, and he's a guy just a little smaller than me. He was a 160-pounder when he in normal weight. So it took him 18 months to recover, left the hospital in October 46. A year later, he moved to Israel. 11 years after that, August 27th, when I was exactly 2 months old, we moved to the United States, and my father died in 2001. A little about me, because I am a part of the book, because of some, as you'll see soon. My name is Jacob Joseph, Joseph with an F, which I have to say all the time. Jacob Joseph Hersch. It's actually the inverse of my grandfather. You know, Jews name their kids generally after dead relatives. So my father preferred my mother preferred the inverse because my mother didn't like Jacob or Joseph. She really liked Jack and Jackie, but she settled for this. I live in New York City. I have 3 adult kids, and my career has been in finance, essentially working with troubled companies. All right, let's go to this picture. So my entire life, I knew my father's story. And I knew it because, among other things, every Passover, my father told the story. You know, Passover is a Jewish holiday where at the Seder, you tell the story of the Jews escaping or leaving Egypt. Well, in the middle of that story, my father would tell his story of escaping from Nazi concentration camp. He also told it to almost anybody who asked, because he had no compunction about sharing that story. I know many survivors, back to my earlier description of them, don't breathe a word of what they went through. My father wasn't that guy. Or another way to think of it is, if you escaped from the Nazis twice, you'd be telling people. So my father liked to tell the story. Okay, so he dies in 2001. In 2007, I get a phone call from my cousin in Israel. She's my age. I'm 49 at the time. So yes, that makes me 60 now. And she calls me up. She says, I was searching for something on the internet for my mom, and I come across a picture of your dad. Google your father. Google Mauthausen and your father, and it comes up. It turns out, so Mauthausen is the concentration camp that he was in. It was in Western Austria. I'll go into that in a little bit in a second. But now today, like Auschwitz, it's still there, and it's a memorial. And they have a website, and they've got a whole organization built around it with a museum. Very important place to visit. You're going to go to Auschwitz, you could go to Mauthausen. On the website is this photo. And there's a caption under it. It says that he had escaped from a death march, had been found by the Friedmanns, not Jewish. We checked baptismal certificates because we were curious. Not Jewish. The Friedman family lived 6 miles from the concentration camp, right where he escaped. And there are no other stories about escapees on this website, or even any other stories about death marches on the website. So, 1, how in the world did Mauthausen get this photo? I don't have it. And 2, how did they know the story? I didn't tell him. My father didn't tell him, as far as I know, and I now know for a fact my father didn't tell him. How did this happen? So, I write Mauthausen, general mailbox number. Hi, I'm Jack Hersch. I'm Dave Hersch's son. Who are you? How do you know this story? How can I help? And over a period of years, I eventually put the story together, and I'll give it to you in a very, very short version here. So October 46, my father leaves the hospital after 18 months. I told you the litany of things that he had. During that time that he was recovering, he did not write home. It never occurred to him to write home through most of those, let's say the first year about, until the late winter of 1946. So call it 10, 11 months after he'd been rescued. And it never occurred to him to write home, because why would it? Knowing what he went through, knowing what everybody went through, there wasn't a chance in the world any of his other 25 family members had survived this war, so he didn't bother. Then he did in January, February of 46, and he gets a response from, it turns out, 2 brothers and a sister out of the 8, so now 4 out of the 8 have survived. And they're back in Dej, and they're actually running the soap factory again. And so then, by the way, they send him a photograph, which I have and which is in the book, of what they looked like a little after the war. It's a really gorgeous photo, and I think it had a lot to do with my father's recovery. Anyway, my father gets on a train to go back to Dej after his recovery is complete. Enns happened to be the dividing line between the Russian zone, or from your perspective, the Russian zone and the American and British zones after the end of World War II. When the Americans were pushing eastward and the Russians were coming from the east pushing westward, they agreed to stop at the Enns River. The Enns River is just at the outskirts of the town of Enns, which is a couple of miles away from Mauthausen. So the train had to stop there, passport control, or whatever else it was, for a number of hours. And my father asked the station master to go to the Friedmann Home. No one had any phones. Go to the Friedmann Home, say, hey, 18 months later, I'm alive, I'm well, I want to thank you again. So he does. Mr. Friedmann comes onto the station platform. They chat for a little bit, and my father gives him this photo, which raises the question, where does my father get this photo from? Because I can guarantee you this. My father did not keep a photo of himself in concentration camp. So I don't know the answer, but I surmise what the answer is. What I think happened was, now he's in the sanatorium/hospital for 18 months. He's beginning to recover into the winter, the late winter and into the spring of 1946. He's got friends. You know, back then I think friends exchanged photographs, and particularly if the friend was of the opposite sex. And I think he wrote to his brothers and sisters, hey, you know that photo? Could you do me a favor and send me a couple copies? And so now he's got a copy and he gives it. I should add something else about this picture. So the photographer who took it used this photo to advertise himself, among other things, to advertise himself around towns. This photo was plastered all over Dej, including after all the Jews of Dej were first deported into a ghetto and then sent to concentration camp. Now, my two uncles and my aunt survived the war. They think my dad is dead. They see the photo still up there. They go to the photographer and say, look, you got to take the picture down. So he does. Then a couple months later, they find out my father's alive. They tell him you can put the picture back up, and he does. Right. But, okay, so my father gives Mr. Friedmann the photo. 20 years later, a senior member of the Austrian Communist Party is doing research on resistance among the Austrians. And a form of resistance is hiding prisoners or helping prisoners in one way, shape, or form. So he decides to walk the death march route from Mauthausen to Gunskirchen, 34 miles away. Knocks on doors and comes up with nothing except the Friedmanns, who tell this guy, his name was Kammerstadter, tell him the story of my father and give him the photo. He's writing a book, and he writes this book, but he doesn't get it published. He dies in the early 90s. His heirs give it to Mauthausen. Then Al Gore invents the internet. Mauthausen has this story. They put it on. My cousin finds it in 2007. And which leads to the question, why don't I know any of this? I mean, as I said, part of the theme of this book, it's not just about my father and his story. It's all there. It's also about me, and why didn't I know things like what the story was with this picture? So, okay, here's what the book is about. It's 3 linked stories. The first story is my father's story, and he tells it from a Seder table. That's how he told it all the time. It happened that the last year of his life, he told the story to me. I was living in California. I came back because he asked me to. You'll see why in the book. He tells me the story. I repeat it in the book the way he told it. The story starts from his time in the hometown of Dej to 11 months in what was categorized by the Nazis as the worst concentration camp in the entire Reich. There were 2 types of concentration camps. Well, 2 broad types. There were death camps and there were labor camps. Death camps weren't rated. They were there for a single purpose. They were there to kill you. Auschwitz, there's actually Auschwitz and Auschwitz II. If you've heard of Birkenau is actually Auschwitz II. It's a few miles away. It was a death camp. There were a few people who worked there, but for the most part, you went there to die. Treblinka was the same thing. Then there were work camps. Auschwitz I was a work camp, and it was rated Stufe 1. It's a German word that means level or rating. Most of the camps were Stufe 1. A few of them were Stufe 2. And by the way, the Stufe 1 camps were not picnics, and they were designed to work you, to put you to use, not feed you well, not treat you well. You were likely to die, but you weren't sent there to die. In Mauthausen and Gusen, which was a sister camp 2 miles away, administered by Mauthausen, you were sent there to die. And it wasn't Jews. It was mostly intellectuals, communists, gays, incorrigible prisoners, incorrigible POWs. That was the prison population of Gusen and Mauthausen. That's why you were sent there. It was a rock mine. Not an interior rock mine, but rock walls. There was one in Gusen, and there was one in Mauthausen. So anyway, that's where my dad was sent. Oh, by the way, he was sent there because they were running out of people to kill, but they still needed to mine this granite, so they started sending Jews there. It was a consolation, but that's what they did. Then there's my story of discovery. First of all, discovery of details of the story my father never told. My father, as I've said, was a funny, interesting, engaging guy. And somehow he made the story of his 11 months in concentration camp funny, interesting, and engaging. Funny a little bit, very interesting, very engaging. But he would smile at parts of it. I'm like, there's nothing funny about 11 months in a concentration camp. So now I'm discovering, in working on this book, that there is a lot more to his story that he never, ever told. And by the way, at one point, you find out early in the book, he went back to Mauthausen and never told me in the late 1990s. I never knew. So why didn't he tell me? Why didn't I know? Why didn't I go back, for that matter? And then that leads to things that I discover about myself that I never realized, that also really came from having a father like this. The third thread of the book is about the 65th Infantry Division, which was part of Patton's Third Army. Most people have heard of Patton and know about his lightning move across Europe from essentially just south of, he didn't start at Normandy, he started just south of Normandy. From Normandy all the way, he was aimed at Berlin, then he was given a detour to head south and actually headed toward Enns and Mauthausen. So I follow them from Mississippi to where they land when this 65th Infantry Division lands at Le Havre, all the way through finding my father. I don't know who found my father. I wish I did. I can't find, I made quite an effort. I couldn't find. All I know is I know the regiment that found them, which was the 261st. So let me talk a little bit about my father's story. In November 1943, Hungary was given Transylvania in 1940. But there were no Germans, essentially, in Hungary, or very, very few, until November 1943. And in November 1943, Germans were moved in, and they were moved into the town of Dej. These were logistics troops. These were formerly frontline guys. They were no longer frontline. They'd been to war. They had enough of it. My father actually became friendly with a couple of them who were billeted in his home. On May 3rd, 1944, with no warning, all the Jews in town, about 7,500 out of a population of 15,000, all the Jews in town were moved to a ghetto. And by the way, just as an aside, you think a ghetto, you probably have an image in your mind. This is back to images and what reality is different. In the case of Dej, the ghetto was a field. It was a square mile of a field a mile or so out of town. They said, that's yours. Good luck. They were there for about a month. On June 6th, my father and most of his family were shipped off to Auschwitz, the rest of his family 2 days later. Back to that 25 number I said earlier, one of them was my grandfather, who died of a heart attack a few days after all the Jews were ordered to wear the Star of David. They weren't ordered to wear the Star of David until around March or April of 1944. Then one uncle and one uncle through marriage were sent into labor battalions. They were in a work battalion elsewhere in Hungary, and so that was what they did during the war. One survived, my uncle who survived, one did not survive. Of the 22 who were shipped to Auschwitz, 18 were killed within an hour of arriving there.
Oh, God.
On June 13th, my father arrived in Mauthausen concentration camp. And this, by the way, here, this is just a quick graphic of the route. So it's 293 miles from Dej in the bottom right to Auschwitz in Poland, and it took him one night. And then a few days later, my father was put in with 50 other Jews who had come from his hometown and the surrounding areas over a 3-night trip, 245 miles to Mauthausen, south and west. So my father went to Mauthausen and often used the word Mauthausen even when he meant Gusen. Gusen was 2.5 miles away, downhill. They were both rock mines, very, very similar. This is an Allied aerial photo of Gusen in late 44 or early 45. I take it, I did it, I put it up here because I just sort of wanted you to see what it looked like sort of generally. And because also, this next slide shows this area today. It is a housing development, which frankly shocks me. But let's just look at what it is. So on the left is Gusen 2. Gusen, there were actually two Gusens right next to each other. The first one that was built first, and then a few years later, Gusen 2. My father started in Gusen 2. But whether he was in Gusen 2 or Gusen 1, he worked in the Kastenhof mine and by the stone crusher in the upper right. That street on the bottom, the bright yellow Georgestrasse, if you look here, it's still there. It's the delineation of the southern part of that little pretty community. One last thing that you'll see in the book. You see it says your house on the bottom right? Your house is the name given to the administrative building in a concentration camp. It's an all-purpose building. It could be administrative, it could be a jail. In the case of Gusen, it was actually also the entranceway to the camp. There was, in this structure, there was an archway built in the middle of it. Well, I put it up here because, see here that your house is still there? It's a home. People live there.
Oh, my God.
I met them. Really nice people. I know they are nice people, but I met them and I talk about it in the book. It was not the easiest meeting I ever had. The stone crusher, which is next to the Kastenhof mine, is in this picture, or this series of pictures. So, okay, the top part. Towards the right of the top part, you can see the cliff. It's a 100-foot cliff. It's a sheer granite cliff. All the way on the left in the corner is the stone crusher. It's actually a trio of buildings. It was the largest stone crusher in Europe. Its purpose was to take granite and bring it down anywhere from a couple of inches in diameter to pulverized, actually, essentially powder. And then one of those three buildings was a storage building. One of those three buildings was where you actually put the granite in. And one of the farthest right building, which no longer exists, was where this huge, massive, expensive mechanical crusher was. You can see on the bottom left the three buildings, and the rightmost building of the bottom left is where the crusher was, and it is no longer there. The bottom right, that's what it looks like today. It actually was sort of a winter photo with no trees, but the trees actually do get leaves on them at some point. I walked it. I'll talk to you about it in a minute. Okay. So when my father was in Gusen 2 and Gusen 1, here's what he did. In Gusen 2, he worked in the Kastenhof Kommando. Now, they called groups of prisoners who worked in an area, they called where they worked a commando, which is actually the same word that the British like to use the word commando a lot for groups of soldiers. The Germans just applied it to groups of prisoners. He was in the Kastenhof Commando, and his job there was to take granite that had been coming off the rock wall and bring it into a central storage area, a central collection area. It was very difficult work, but he said it wasn't the worst work in the world, because when they would dynamite the granite, they had to stop working until they got more granite to work with, so they actually got little breaks here and there. But Gusen 2 was a horrendous place to be, and he got lucky. They moved him to Gusen 1, which was a slightly better concentration camp to be in. There he was in the Stone Crusher Commando. His job, it turns out I found a photo on the internet from Mauthausen that exactly shows what my father's job was in the Stone Crusher Commando. His job was to take up to about 50, 60-pound boulders of granite, put it in a mine cart. Those things are called mine carts that you see around mines. Put it in a mine cart, push it about 200 yards to that Stone Crusher building, empty it, push the empty cart back, load it up, push the cart again, Sisyphusian, or however you want to pronounce it. But that's what it was. This is what he did 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, for the entire time that he was there. Oh, and let's not forget how little they fed him. And it just turns out that I found this photo that really portrays almost exactly what he did. Towards the end of November 1944, he was in such bad condition, he ended up in the infirmary, which he liked to call the Revier, which it's a German word that's short for Krankenrevier. He was in the infirmary barracks. He was there for just a few weeks, and they emptied the barracks and moved him up to Mauthausen concentration camp. So that's this. So now he's moved back to Mauthausen where he started. In Mauthausen, he was in their Revier, which they first called the Russenlager and then later called the Sanitätslager until March 1945. March 45, they moved him to a tent camp. Let me tell you why. So by the time you got to the late winter, early spring of 1945, the Germans were well aware that they were losing the war. You had the Russians, well, from your perspective, you had the Russians 100-odd miles to the west, to the east, coming west. You had the Americans and British 100, 150 miles to the west, coming east. And so what they decided to do was take all the Jews in the surrounding area, and I mean about 100 miles in radius, and move them all to Mauthausen. But Mauthausen didn't have the room for them. Mauthausen was already overcrowded with essentially non-Jews. So what they did is they built a camp called the tent camp, which was, because it was called that, it was only tents. Mauthausen, 37 acres surrounded by huge granite walls. To the south of Mauthausen is this photo. To the north of Mauthausen was the tent camp. Horrible sanitary conditions, deplorable place to have to live. My father was there for a few weeks, never, ever spoke about it. Anyhow, this photo is a photo that what this Russenlager or Sanitätslager looked like on the field to the south of Mauthausen. And I want to read you what I wrote about when I first saw this. So when I went to visit, Mauthausen Memorial had gotten a guide for me, a woman named Angelica Schlackel, who was phenomenal. I had a number of contacts there, but she was the primary one who helped me find out a lot about my father. We drove there, park in the parking lot, and then we start walking out of the parking lot. And I'm going to pick up from there. It's going to be, I'm going to read this, and I'll read something else in a few minutes. Angelica and I are walking along the path paralleling the camp's south wall leading to the front gate. She tells me that the field I had been eyeing from the parking lot, and it's a completely barren, empty field. It doesn't look like this at all. There's nothing there. She tells me that the field I'd been eyeing from the parking lot, now on our left, was actually two fields during the war years. The part closest to the parking lot was a ball field used by the SS Guards for recreation. Quote, "They played football on it," she says. "You're soccer." Football? Soccer? I am so astounded that I stop. The Nazi guards had a soccer pitch to play on, so they could stay in shape, relax, forget about their cares, and have a good time in between details, guarding and beating and killing men like my father? How nice, I finally say, and Angelica's weak grin shows she gets my sarcasm. She tells me the rest of the field was originally called Russenlager, or Russian camp. Dad was there, I think to myself. Continuing, Angelica says, when Hitler turned on Stalin in 1941, Mauthausen's Ketzettlers, so prisoners called each other Ketzettlers. And when my father told the story, he would call them, or call himself even, a Ketzettler. The reason is, in German, concentration camp is a word, and I'm not going to pronounce it right. It starts with a K, concentration lager. Lager means camp. Well, the Konsen, it's a Z. So KZ was usually the abbreviation that the Germans used for concentration camp. Sometimes they use KL for concentration camp lager. Anyway, KZ, pronounced in German, is Ketzet, and then they added an LER so you can make a word out of it, so it's Ketzettler. So, okay. Mauthausen's Ketzettlers covered the field with new wooden barracks, anticipating an influx of Russian prisoners of war, parentheses. Every wall, structure, barracks, and path in KZ Mauthausen was built by its prisoners. But while the Russians originally came in sufficient numbers to require their own section of the camp, by the time the Russenlager was completed, most of them had been killed. So instead, the barracks became a camp infirmary. I tell Angelica my father spent time between late 44 and early 1945 in the Russenlager in what he always called the Revier, pronounced like Paul Revere. She says she recalls me writing about that in an email, adding that Revier is short for Krankenrevier, German for infirmary or military hospital. Now she's talking. But this was not the main reason. This was not the main Revier in Mauthausen, she clarifies. Also, when your father was there, it was not anymore called Russenlager, as you wrote, because there were no Russian prisoners there. Instead, it was called Sanitätslager, the sanitary camp. There were doctors there and very sick prisoners, but they had almost no medicines. But yes, I understand why your father called it Revier. I studied the field more closely, and Angelica steps away from me. I should tell you that my view was the exact same view. This was taken from that path that I'm now standing on. I studied the field more closely, and Angelica steps away from me, giving me space. My father had been somewhere on that turf for 3 months. Though it is now barren, I easily picture row after row of German field-grade barracks filling the field when Dad was a Ketzettler here. This is why I've come. This is what I want to see. Places my father existed. Places where he persevered. Places where he beat the odds. My palms are moist, and I'm sweating in spite of the pleasant temperature. But at least my hands are steady now. I'm somewhat overwhelmed, as if I'm nearing sensory overload. This field in front of me is where my father lay on a bed, or a cot, or a plank of wood, or I'm frankly not sure what, and tried to remain among the living. My senses are operating in overdrive, like I'm taking in too much too fast. I try for a moment to relax my breathing. After a short spell, I'm ready to move on. All right, so my father spent time in there till March, then he moved to the tent camp, and from the tent camp to the death marches. Now, I should tell you, we know that they're called death marches. They didn't call them that. In fact, to the day my father died, he never heard of the term death march, and I rarely heard of the term death march because I didn't do any research, because I knew all about the Holocaust because of my dad, right? So I didn't know there were these death marches out there, other than marches where they went from point A to point B. And my father called them transport. It's a German word and an English word, which just basically is the idea of going from point A to point B. If you go on a train, if you walk, if you're in a bus, it's a transport. So my father said these were transports, but we know them to be death marches. It was a 34-mile march. This yellow line in this map shows 7 miles of it. They started in Mauthausen, the M on the top, downhill about 1,400 feet to the Danube River. Now they're essentially at Gusen. Now they're essentially at sea level. They walk down toward the town of Enns. There's a number 1 at the bottom of the town of Enns, at the bottom of it. That's where he escaped the first time. He was recaptured a few weeks later, same route, gets past number 1, no chance to escape. A mile and a half later, point number 2, he escapes again. I know what you're thinking. Okay. This is a little bit of a blow-up of the area where he had the second escape. What's important about it is the Friedmann family lived where that arrow was pointing. This is off Google Earth. Up at the top, where number 2, where he escaped the second time, is actually the intersection of a small, thin path or road from the Friedmann home up to there. They happened to be walking the morning after my father escaped the second time, and they saw him, and they took him that night back to their home. Now, they kept him in their home for nearly a week. Fighting was getting very close, and they came to him and said, we can't keep you here any longer. The fighting is getting too close, and we've now been asked to keep SS troops in our house, so we can't keep you there. Now, okay, I'm going to give away something from the book. Well, my father didn't know till the day he died, but I found out in researching it, it wasn't true that they were keeping SS troops upstairs, and so they had to move. There had been SS troops up there for 6 months. While my father was downstairs, the SS troops were upstairs. And I'll show you a picture of the front of the house. There are 2 doors towards the back. One door leads to my father, one door leads to their billet. That's who the Friedmanns were. Okay, so they tell my dad, you got to go into, they have a barn in the field. They were not farmers. Mr. Friedmann was a very successful brick mason. He had people who worked for him. They lived in a hamlet. It essentially was surrounded by farms. They said to him, we have a barn in the field, a storage barn. You go there on a Saturday night, we'll give you directions, and they gave him a few potatoes to hold on so that in case they had to miss a day to go feed him, and we'll feed you every day until the coast is clear and then we'll get you back. My dad got lost. Spent a week in the field by a stream. So I say to my dad, well, how'd you get lost? He goes, how do you get lost? I don't know. I got lost. I mean, come on, he's a teenager. It's pitch black. It is wartime. It is a blackout. There's nothing, right? There's no light. Oh, and by the way, it was cloudy and rainy the entire week. So there's no light at all. He got lost. To this day, or to the day he died, he has no idea how. I figured out how. In part, by the help of Google Earth, in part, and as you'll read, or as you might read, by a process of trying to follow in his footsteps. Okay, but I'm going to give you a little bit of what I went through. So the house faces the road in the same direction as that arrow. He goes out of the house. If he goes to the right, he heads up north toward that number 2 sign again, where he escaped the first time. Well, that road, not only was it the Death March route, but it was a major military route. It's a hamlet. It's only a quarter of a mile away. It's hard to tell by this picture. It's only a quarter mile. At night, sound travels. My dad's hearing trucks and tanks. He's not going to the right, so he goes left. If you go left, you can't really see it here, but there are photos in the book where you can see 100 yards from the house is a sort of a fork, kind of a Y intersection. If you go to the left, there's a barn there today, and I'm told there were more barns there back 70-odd years ago. If you go to the left, I think he finds a barn. If you go to the right, remember how dark it is? You go to the right, you walk about 100 yards, and you open up to this expanse of fields. You can see the fields. That's all you see when you're at ground level. And he got lost. And so somewhere in those fields, actually there's a stream that cuts through it. He found that stream, and he stayed by that stream for a week until the family dog found them. And then they kept him another week, and then the Americans came through. Okay, that's my dad's story. Americans came through, he lives. Well, you know he lives. My story. Once I realized how little I knew, I had to go there myself. So I went there. I chronicle in the book my trip back there. And as I said, I weave my trip in what I saw with what my father is describing during his time, during the Seder telling of the story. But raises the question, why hadn't I gone sooner? Why didn't my father tell me that he went back when he went back? Why did my father leave out so much detail? Mauthausen Memorial, hugely helpful to me. The curator of Mauthausen Memorial wrote the foreword to the book and was helpful. Angelica Schlackel, among others, walked all these grounds with me, was very helpful. I walked the grounds of Mauthausen and Gusen. I stood by the stone crusher. if there was an emotional moment among many, it was standing in front of the stone crusher, that this big garage door opening, realizing that not within feet, but within inches, I'm standing where my father stood when he worked at the stone crusher commando. I traced my father's death march route, which I just showed you, and I found the 2 places where my father escaped. And in doing that, by the way, all I had was my father's words as he described it. In order to find, I worked with Angelica and with the curator, Christian Duer, and others to try to figure out these 2 places, and we got them, without a doubt, exactly. I'm going to show you how I did one of them. It's here. First, I'm going to read you part of this first escape. Now, this is my father. I'm writing what my father is telling us at the Seder table. My father is essentially picking it up from that first yellow arrow that's heading down south before it turns for the marchers, turns right to head west. And my father had just maybe a mile or 2, I don't know how far, maybe a mile or 2 earlier, had gone to the side of the road. If you went to the side of the road in a death march, they shot you. I mean, you marched or you died. And remember, they didn't call them death marches. My father didn't know that, but that's what happened. My father went to the side of the road a mile or 2 before this was about to happen. He didn't get shot. Doesn't know why. The energy that coursed through him in not being shot got him back on the road. Here's what happens. With his renewed energy, he pushed himself to move again. Not much further along, at the outskirts of the town of Enns, the route hit a short, steep incline, a couple of 100 yards from bottom to top. That's that first arrow. It's actually a steep incline. Because remember, this is an ancient town. It's the oldest town in Austria, and it's on a hilltop. Okay. Short, steep incline, a couple of 100 yards from bottom to top. My father crested it, and that was the last of his newfound power. He'd given everything he had left to give. Only inertia kept his feet moving one ahead of the other. A few more yards, and he reached a major intersection. From his left, from the south, that's the red line now. Thousands of soldiers and refugees were flowing north, away from the town of Steyr toward Enns. The Mauthausen settlers were heading west, cutting across the intersection and in front of the desperate refugees. SS guards accompanying the marchers had their hands full keeping the refugees from charging into the intersection while the settlers were crossing. Boiling like lava in a volcano ready to blow, the mass of civilians and soldiers agitated while the Jews filed slowly past them. Finally, the SS halted the marchers immediately behind my father. He was the last one into the junction. Inching across the long crossroads, you can see how long it is in this photo. Inching across the long crossroads, step after ponderous step, he was simply too small and inconsequential for the refugees. Their scramble away from the fighting could not wait another second. They went, plunging into the intersection before my father could get through. In a second, he was drowning in a streaming lava flow of Austrian townspeople and German soldiers. Nearly panicked at first, with adrenaline flooding him, his clarity suddenly became total. He could see his fellow marchers, and he knew if he kept going, he'd eventually reach them. Or, if he turned quickly, he would be swept up and carried along with the refugees. Now this is him talking at the table. I thought about it for just 1 second. Then I turned, and no one noticed. My father's eyes shone brightly. I took a few steps, and I was worried that I was wearing my prison clothes, but right in front of me was a raincoat on the ground. I picked it up and put it on. Reaching down with his hand, he did it again for me. It fit me exactly. The Nazi troopers monitoring the march never saw my father's snap maneuver. He heard someone call his name, a fellow settler, judging by the accent. He ignored it. He was not about to turn around. He didn't dare do anything but walk straight ahead. My father's heart was booming in his chest. With his KZ Mauthausen prison uniform invisible beneath the raincoat, he blended in. Even his hair didn't give him away. The Nazis shaved a line down the middle of every Mauthausen prisoner's head, a reverse mohawk. But my father's head hadn't been shaved in weeks, and his hair had grown in enough so that the line in the center was no longer noticeable. He looked like any other refugee fleeing the fighting. He was moving on some burst of energy that 30 seconds earlier hadn't existed, and now he could feel that energy waning quickly. He didn't have much stamina left. He took stock. The intersection was big and busy and had no houses facing it. Fields and structures on either side offered no doors to knock on, but he could see ahead that the street narrowed. Its walls bore the doors and windows of small homes behind them. He scooted to the side of the street and approached one of the doors. Now, him talking again. I wasn't sure what I should do. I was so tired and so hungry I couldn't go much further, but it was very dangerous to knock. He had no idea who might be on the other side of the door. The person might be a lifelong Nazi and shoot him dead or hold him until the SS came to kill him. Or the person might be sympathetic. He knocked. So you get it. Well, he lives. You know he lives. Okay. So that's what the intersection looked like. Now, in the upper left, hard to read, but I'll read it for you. This is the information I had and Angelica had when we were trying to figure out where this first intersection was. One, we knew it was on the Death March route. And we knew that because it was always the same route, and he escapes the second time after passing the same intersection the second time and not being able to escape that time. So we know it's on the route. Two, as my father just said, it's at the beginning of town. Three, it's a major intersection, and it's got to be because there are all these refugees and soldiers coming up from the town of Steyr, which was 20 miles to the south. And this is no longer a major road, but at the time it was. We actually had the mayor help us out on that. It's a half a mile from, I wrote the cops, but from a gendarmerie station, which was gendarme, essentially their national police. My father had described it as a half a mile away. When my father described distances and time in the book, time he tended to get a little wrong. Distances he tended to nail. It was remarkable. And then, as I just showed you, when he was telling the story, and he always turned right. And he would do this. I turned right. So, okay, it had to be a right turn. Well, that's a right turn. Finally, he walked, two other things. One, he walked a few yards. Why didn't he knock on the door right away? When I used to hear the story, I thought it was because it was huge, open expanse of fields. No, it's just that there were no doors facing the street until it narrowed. And finally, after he ended up in a home, the person gave him a little food and allowed him to wait in the person's backyard. They had a backyard. Well, you may not be able to see, but some of the homes where the street narrows have a backyard. Everything fits. That was the intersection where my father escaped 70-odd years ago. This is a picture of the Friedmann home. Remember I told you about the SS were upstairs and they were downstairs? If you can see it, all the way to the far right, there were two doors. One of them was part of the house originally, and one of them, you can kind of see the different coloring even of the house, is what Mr. Friedmann built. This is the Friedmans. Okay, Barbara Friedman's not the most felt person in the world. This is the only photo we have of her. Apparently she, to use an expression, wore the pants in the family. She was tough, she kept the books in the business, and she smoked cigars. That's Ignaz in his World War I uniform. He was a really sweet guy, a very capable guy, obviously, and an incredibly heroic guy, no question. Okay, last slide, actually. Why I wrote the book. One, every time I tell this story, it elicits reactions. I've told it, my father told it plenty of times. It would come up at business dinners. And in fact, one particular time, right before I started writing, I get a phone call from one of the guys I was at dinner with the next day. He says, I've never met a survivor. I've never met anyone that I've known to be related to a survivor. This story has changed my life. It has changed my perspective on life. And I realized that I've heard that before. If I could put this in writing, I could do that for a lot of other people, so I'm going to do that. And then also, a lot of people would tell me they didn't know that survivors led normal lives, kind of like how I started this conversation with, by saying people who hear about survivors have a perspective based on sort of what's in the public domain, which in my father's case, and in the case of my father's friends, just wasn't right. Another reason I wrote it, I think it's a pretty good story. It's escape, evasion, survival. It's a good story. Lessons to be learned. There are incredible lessons to be learned from my father's survival. One, never, ever give up. I wasn't going to tell this, but I've got you. I'm going to tell you something interesting. My daughter, I think it's interesting. My daughter teaches last chance kids in Chicago. And while I was working on the book, she said, it would be really interesting if you could talk to my kids. These are 15 to 20-year-old kids. All of them have been in jail, most of them gang members, toughest of toughest kids imaginable. This is their last shot. Talk to them about Saba, about her grandfather. Tell them the story. I sent them some of the pictures. The question that came up more than anything after I was done was how these kids related to my dad. I thought they would relate to my dad. They're being incarcerated because of whatever biases there are in society, and my father was a Jew, and that's why it happened to him. No. The connection was, he was in jail, we were in jail. How did he wake up every morning knowing there was no end in sight? You had to work this rock mine for 12 hours. They were feeding you next to nothing. All they wanted you was dead. Why bother? How did you do that day after day? Okay? Which leads to the next lesson. We can endure so much more than we thought. When you think your gas tank's at 0, you've got tons of room left of endurance. You just do. Then unexpected lessons. This is something that came out both in talking about to people about it and in my own research. Our parents, all of us, our parents have pasts that impact us. It doesn't matter if your father was a CEO or a fireman or a war hero or a delivery man, homemaker, a criminal. Doesn't matter what your parents' background were. They impact who we are. You should know what it is before it's too late. It was too late for me. I had to do a lot of digging and still never got to the bottom of a lot of things. It's not too late for people who read the book. And then we should learn about the past. I just said that. Finally, the most obvious reason, we can't forget. It isn't just that we can't forget what happened to the Jews in Europe. We can't forget about the possibility of genocides. We can't forget when we're in a divisive time what that nth degree of that looks like. It's happened in Africa. It's happened in Europe. It could happen again. You can't say it can't happen again. Because Germany in the 20s, they were all saying it couldn't happen here, and it did. So that's why I wrote it. Anyway, that's my book. I'd love to take questions from you. Anything, everything.
Do you have siblings?
I do. I have a brother 4 years younger. And what's interesting about, you touch on an interesting topic with that. So he's interested that I wrote the book, but it only goes so far. We talked about it, and he believes that he was completely unaffected or unimpacted by the fact that he had a father that had gone through all that he'd gone through, which just sort of goes to show you, well, I couldn't disagree with that more. I think that it is important that we understand kind of why we are the way we are because of our parents to some degree. My brother's just not there. But that's okay, I love him anyway.
What did the Germans do with all
Sort
that?
of what I think is an obvious question, but why didn't they kill him when he was recaptured?
I don't know the answer to that. I will tell you that eventually he ended up in a police station, or a gendarmerie, they called it, the gendarme office and headquarters. And so all the gendarmes, first of all, the Germans allowed the national police as the gendarmerie to remain in place. They reported to Heinrich Himmler, but they remained in place. They had different uniforms. They were all older, because if you were younger, you were, by definition, fighting. My father never said this, but I'm certain. My father turned to this guy and said, you know, my father fought for the same army that you fought for in World War I. Right? But I don't really know the answer. At the end of the day, all I know is my father spent the night in that jail and was taken back to the camp and not killed. You touch on a broader question that I go into in the book. There are a half a dozen times where he should have been killed. And, I mean, for things he flat out did wrong, and he wasn't killed. And so I sort of, to kind of get a little bit to the end, I think as conjecture, part of the reason for that, among other things, is that, look, he was an interesting, engaging guy. He spoke 8 languages, 9 if you included English, which he learned after the war, or he would say 10 if you included Greek, because if he didn't understand it, it was Greek to him. That's his joke, not mine. But because he spoke all these languages, he spoke German fluently, he spoke Polish, he spoke Spanish, which he learned in the camps. There were a lot of Spaniards there. I think that he just connected with people, and I just think that the guys in charge, you can't kill a guy you kind of like. You can't, and they didn't. And that's my only answer.
So I don't know when you started your project of research. Did you or your dad ever speak with Claude Lanzmann, who spent 10 years researching this stuff, not far from Mauthausen?
I did not. I don't even know the name. I didn't start working on this until 6 years after my dad died. Was the first inkling that I even cared, as I said, and as you would read. So my dad tells this story twice a year at least, and sometimes more often than that, and I'm like just listening. And I've got all these questions that I never asked. I've got all these open data points that I don't fill in the blanks. It's like, yeah, okay, that's interesting. Next.
Well, you should see this movie. It's 9.5 hours long. It's called Shoah.
Okay.
Done by Claude Lanzmann.
Okay,
It was
I will.
1985, but you can.
That's a
they
great
have
thought.
it at the Westchester Library System, actually. You can take it out.
That's a great thought.
Yeah.
you look around, does it concern you that there's no youth here?
Wait.
Well,
That there's one youth.
I'm going to take my jacket. It's a little warm up here. Look, that's a great point, and the but is that I'm going to Morristown next week to speak to 350 high school kids. In November, I went to Enns, and in between Enns and Linz, but towns surrounding Mauthausen, I spent 2.5 days meeting a total of about 1,200 kids in various groups, giving them not really this presentation, but a slightly different version where I went through, I didn't think they were reading the book, so I went through the entire story of my father, and it was more than just telling them the story, it was making them realize, none of these people had ever met a Jew before. They never, and I mean it that way, they never met a Jew. The only way they knew anything about Jews is if they read anything in school, or if they saw movies from World War II, so they assume all of us weigh 80 pounds. One of the groups was actually a vocational school, where I was warned ahead of time, 300 kids, most of them from right-wing families. So good luck with that. And I went up there, and I basically, what I did, I'll explain to you for better or for worse, what I did with these kids is I said, I'm a Jew. And I play hockey, and I fly planes, and I teach martial arts, and I ticked off a couple other stupid things I do. But I said, that's a Jew. It's not just what you may have perceived in your own mind, but it's these other things as well. And my father, that's why I took those photos I showed you. I had actually 3 other pictures of my photo. My dad's a decent-looking guy. That's a Jew.
He doesn't have horns.
So when you ask about kids, you're right, it does concern me, but, so like I said, Morristown next week, I'm going to Chicago. A buddy of mine, his kid goes to Catholic school. 350 kids are listening to me in March. It's starting to happen. It needs to happen much, much more, because they need to be reminded. So, super point, exactly, you're on point exactly. And yeah, it concerns me, but I'm trying to make a change about that.
I have a close friend in Mount Kisco who was fortunate or unfortunate. He survives, therefore is fortunate. When they split up the area of Hungary, so forth, his family ended up, he's 5 years younger than your father. They ended up in Romania rather than in Hungary
Interesting.
when they
And
split
they
up
weren't deported, probably.
the empire. And he was part of the exile to Transnistria
Wow.
in Ukraine. And of course, the Romanians being always looking for a way out, when they saw that the Germans might lose, they allowed some of the people from Transnistria to return to the area that became part of Romania.
Interesting.
And they, he was 5 years younger than your,
Yeah, that's interesting.
Your father-
Well, they all had incredible experiences.
so he was a toddler when he was originally exiled. But they returned. There's a very excellent book on the killing of the Jews, or the adventures of the Jews, whatever you want to call it, in Romania during the Second World War. It was a PhD thesis at the University of Paris.
So buy that after you buy my book.
Pardon me?
Buy that after you buy my book.
And he in that, there's a very good description of the exile of the Romanian Jews from that area
Interesting.
of Europe to Transnistria, and their eventual, those who survived,
Right.
because many of them died in the train.
Right.
Okay, let's just go
Que-
on with questions.
Question? Go ahead.
How did you know the exact route for the death march? Because I, for years, tried to research one that my grandfather was on from Auschwitz. And I can.
So, great question. When I first started digging into my, so the question was, how did I know the exact route of the death march that my father was on? And the answer is, when I started working on this, they didn't know the exact route. They had a couple of possibilities about parts of the route. I mean, when Kammersteiner had written his book in the 60s, he knew, but it was just, the information was lost. So, in fact, there was a historian who said there's no way my father walked across the Danube over a bridge. They took everybody by boat. And my response was, there's no way my father went in a boat, because my father knew down to the inch some things that happened to him. He wasn't on a boat. He would have told me he was on a boat. Eventually, over the years, they got to the point where, I don't know how they did it, they know exactly where it is. And so we knew the exact route. Is there a question in the...
Do you know anything about how the Friedmans managed to house the Nazis and the...
Yeah, I do, because I was there, and I met the grandson and granddaughter. Well, the granddaughter kind of stayed in the background until I was in Enns on last November, and she appeared, and I met her. But the grandson is a monk in Austria, and I met him a few years ago while I was working on the book. So what happened was, my father was downstairs in a room called a Kuhstall, which in English would be a cow stall or a cow room. Houses in Austria, many of them had these rooms. It's like taking your den and deciding to put a couple cows and sheep in there. But that's what they did. No, but that's literally that's how they did it. And they got milk from it and whatever else they got. I don't know. My father was in this Kuhstall. Upstairs, that other door in the southern end of the house, directly upstairs, Mr. Friedmann had built rooms for the SS troops to live. And there was actually a hole in the floor, so I guess you could pass food up or down, or whatever reason he put this hole in. There's a hole there. My father's right below them. I don't know how they pulled this off, or even why, although I do try to conjecture why, but they did.
Were they ever recognized as?
No, so they were, great question. They are not recognized as
righteous.
the righteous. And the reason for it is, my father did the Shoah tape. So I knew this, as I've told you numerous times, I've known this story my entire life. But in 1996, before he went back, and didn't tell me, he did the Shoah tape. And by the way, even that he didn't tell me until like 1998 or 1999. And he said it so flippantly that I didn't even bother listening to it until 8-9 years after he died. Anyway, on the tape, he makes it clear that when he met the Friedman family that morning, the morning of the 17th, he told them he was an escaped Czechoslovakian prisoner, not that he was Jewish. And when he left their house on May 6th to go meet the Americans, go find the Americans, I should say, he said to them, "I'm a Jew." And he says that they were surprised. Now, they told Kammersteiner they've known all along he was Jewish because only Jews were on death marches. Well, that turned out to be not 100% true, but only Jews were on those death marches going by their house. So they say they knew, but because my father said they didn't know he was Jewish, they're not eligible. So, yeah, I mean, trust me, I feel badly that, but
It's very hard to get.
what are you going to do? I mean, I think they knew. They had to know. But my father believed that they didn't know, and that's what sank it for him.
Your father escaped twice, so we can assume he was recaptured and escaped again?
Yes. Yeah. So the first time, so I stop you at the knock on the door. I won't give you the middle, but eventually he ends up in this police station. The cop makes sure he gets clear passage back to Mauthausen to start again. So there were 20,000 Jews in Mauthausen by the time he got to the beginning of April. You can't put 20,000 Jews in a march. What they did was between 500 and 1,000 Jews at a time, because that's the size you can guard well. They're going 34 miles. Remember, they didn't call it a death march. I've run marathons. That's another thing I did. So I've run marathons. 26 miles is incredibly far. Now try walking 34 miles when you weigh half your body weight that you're supposed to weigh, okay? They're designed to kill you. And they don't have the gas chamber facilities to kill 20,000 people. That's why they put them on death marches. And by the way, Gunskirchen, which was where they were going, 34 miles away, was an enclosure. It had a couple of barracks. It had no food, no water, nothing. So thousands, out of the 20,000, more than half of them died on the march or while they were in Gunskirchen, and another 1,000 died after the Americans came in. So it was designed to kill them. My father escaped the first time, was recaptured, and then went on another, was assigned to another march about 10 days later. We know the date, April 16th, escaped again. In the back?
Two questions. What did they do with the rock that they ground into powder? And I'm assuming your father had the number on his arm somewhere.
Okay, so the rock, powder I don't know, but most of the rock was used for, it was various uses, but, so Hitler had this idea of a 1,000-year Reich. And a 1,000-year Reich, it was going to use a lot of granite. So some of it, not the stuff that was pulverized or crushed, but a lot of it was handled by stonemasons for facades for buildings. The stuff that was crushed were for roadways and for railroad track beds. As far as the tattoo goes, he did not have one because almost exclusively the only people who had them that I'm aware of are Auschwitz inmates, people who stayed there. If you were coming through Auschwitz, you didn't get my father had a number, but he didn't have it tattooed on. So if you see a tattoo, that's somebody who worked Auschwitz.
That's when I have cousins.
Questions? Sorry, yes.
What did you learn from the Germans who you saw afterwards, the right-wing folks, as to why they were so compliant about the genocide?
What did I learn from them?
About the Germans being so compliant about the Nazi regime?
Well, that's a deep, complicated question. I don't have a good answer for you. I mean, I think one of the things that's occurred to me in researching this, first of all, yes, that was then and this is now, and I don't hold anything towards. And my father, frankly, didn't at the end, not in the beginning of his life, not in the 1950s, but by the time he died, he had basically forgiven the Germans for what he had gone through. I bought a Jaguar. He wanted to know I didn't buy a BMW or Mercedes. I was like, Dad? But I think it's a complex question. Could it happen? Let me turn the question slightly differently. Could it happen here?
Yep.
I frankly don't know why the answer to that question would be no. Yeah, it could happen here. It could happen anywhere, right? It just can. So I don't have a great answer to your question. I just think that the more we remember that it happened, the better the odds that it doesn't happen again.
That's true.
So I gather from what you said that you felt that your father's experience impacted your life.
No question.
Did you write about that in the book?
Oh yeah, a lot. I mean, I kind of
Share.
touched a little bit on it. So okay, so my father does the impossible. He not only survives 11 months in a concentration camp, he escapes twice at 80 pounds. So I wanted to join the Army. My father said no. My mom died when I was 13. He goes, I lost most of my family. I lost my wife. I'm not losing my son. So you're not going in the Army. Okay, fine. So I fly planes and I jump out of planes and I run marathons and I cycle far and I teach karate and so I do a lot of stuff and I try to dig into why. I mean, I have lots of friends who do 1 or 2 or 3 of these things, but 7 or 8, and I think the answer is I'm always trying to equal him. And now, by the way, just to take it to another level, so my grandfather, remember I told you, was a cavalry soldier in the Army. In the cavalry were the elite. And he spent 4 years in a Russian prisoner war camp. I'm sure my father said, well, what was I next to my father? What, I spent 11 months in a concentration camp? That's nothing compared to 4 years in a Russian prisoner war camp. I'm sure he said that. So we're all trying to look good in our parents' eyes. And so, yes, I go into it a lot in the book. I think you'll like me at the end, but I don't know. Yes.
Your father made the second escape good.
Yes, he did, because he ended up bothering me. Was there? Yes.
So what was the reason for the death march? Because the war was coming to an end. Was it to move away from the Russians?
To get rid of
It was to kill the Jews. They didn't want Jews alive. No, they didn't. They couldn't kill. They couldn't kill Jews. It's just not that easy to kill 20,000 Jews in a short period of time. It's not. It's easier to put them on the road and have them die on the road. Literally, they had a gas chamber in Mauthausen, but it could handle only I've seen it, 20, 30 people at a time. I do the math actually in the book. You can't kill 20,000 people in a small gas chamber. You could try, can't do it. Let's just put them on the road. 500 to 1,000 a day. Half of them will die on the road. The other half will die in Gunskirchen, which is south and west. The Russians are out here. The Americans are here, and from your perspective, and the Russians are there, and the camp is way down there. They'll be dead before anybody gets there. That was the idea.
To follow on, so then why an infirmary?
Great question, and I asked that, so here's the when you hear the answer, you go, well, of course. So okay.
I'll wait.
So the answer is, for the average person in a concentration camp, I don't have a great answer, but there were Messerschmitt factories there. And this was an industrial complex, Mauthausen, and so were other concentration camps like Auschwitz. So you had, in many cases, skilled workers. The stonemasons who created the facades were skilled workers. They could take you within an inch of your life in terms of feeding you, and you had to work. But if you got sick, they needed you. These were not replaceable people. They needed you to get better. Just get well enough that we can get you out there and put you through that cycle again. But that was why they had a hospital, not just an infirmary. My father was in the infirmary, but there was a hospital it was a stone structure, so it's still there today at Mauthausen, and it was there to heal the more specialized workers. So that's why.
I might have missed this. When you start writing, do the research for this book, did you still work full time?
I still work full time. Yes. Yes, I did and I do. So yeah, nights and weekends, and a couple of vacation days.
I have comments that I regret that I didn't talk to my father about a lot of story he could have told me. I was during the time I had a full-time job and my family have to support the race, and I did it. By the time have a little bit more time, my father already passed away. So
that is one of the things I hope to get out of this book. Questions?
Where did he meet your mother? Was it in Israel?
It was in
or-
Israel. So my mom was born in Israel. When she was 3 or 4, moved to England, lived there till she was 20, which is why I was Jackie, because it's a classically British name, right? And now I'm Jack, because I like it better, because I'm older. She went back to Israel when she was 20. She taught. My father and 3 of his buddies wanted to learn English. My mom was in the Air Force, living in Haifa, and they hired her to teach English, and my dad got the teacher.
And then why did they move here?
To earn a living, because Israel was just that, literally, I mean it was just that hard to earn a living, and so they did, yes.
You talked about that your father didn't tell you that he had gone back and that you asked, why didn't he tell you that? Were there other things you indicated that you did find out that he didn't tell you, and what were they, and are they in the book?
They are in the book.
Didn't share with you?
They're in the bock. What essentially it was mostly was a level of detail of horror that he left out. I'll give you one simple example very quickly. So he says that when he got to Mauthausen, the first thing they made him do was take a shower. It's actually not true. The first thing that they did when they got to Mauthausen was hike 3.5 miles uphill in the broiling hot June heat after 3.5 days in a boxcar with no food and only a little bit of water. And he never told me he had to take that hike. He said we got off the train, we took a shower. What about that hike? Did he not tell me because he didn't want to? Because he didn't remember? Because he didn't think it was that big of a deal given all the other things he went through? Conjecture. I don't know. But that's just one example. You had a question.
Yeah, I don't really have the right to ask this question because I don't know enough about my parents, and I became extremely curious after they died. Why didn't you start researching this when you were a lot younger?
I have no idea, and I try to go into it in the book. I mean, that's part of what.
Yeah.
Somewhere between page 2 and 276. And I don't know that I ever come up with a solid answer, but I come up with answers.
Yeah.
Do I have an answer? I kind of do, right? A friend of mine read it. Yes.
You made the comparison between your dad and the kids or the young men that your daughter works with.
Yes.
Would you care to see? What I'm wondering is whether or not the Jewish background of your dad has built a greater reserve in the tank than the, let's say, the African-American experience in Chicago.
Well, I'm inclined to say no. I mean, if you consider the fact that the whole point of the state of Israel and the view of a Sabra is that all those 6 million did, 6 out of 6.3 did, was let themselves go like sheep, right? That we didn't resist, we didn't fight back, not once. Now, it's a very complicated piece of history to think about, because in fact there were things like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, there were attempts, and plus, as I go into in the book, for the most part, no one knew where they were going. They thought they were being transported to a relocation camp. They didn't think they were going to death camps or to work camps. One of the most brilliant things the Nazis did was keep that secret. So I think that, look, these people were not military people. These people were just ordinary folks. Whereas I'd like to argue that some of the upbringings that you see in African-American communities, they're tougher upbringings. So I don't know, I don't have a great answer for you. I don't know that my father had any better chance of surviving than if one of these kids happened to have the exact same experience as my dad. I think that my dad just was wired with this will to live. He just wasn't gonna quit. And he was one of those guys. Look, and you had to be lucky to get out of the camps, but you had to have something more than that too sometimes, and my father had something more than that. And I would like to believe, when I read about stories of some African-American kids or Hispanic kids, or just, lower-income kids and what they go through, a lot of them had, I would argue that a lot of them had that too. So, I think it cuts both ways. Is that politically correct of an answer or not?
In the book,